Welcome back, Focus learners, to another explainer. Today, we're turning our attention to a tiny, somewhat obscure volcanic nation that's literally sitting right on the equator. Now, you might be wondering why we're looking at what seems like a mere speck on the map. Well, it turns out this place has actually been a massive focal point of sweeping global history for centuries. It's basically a perfect microcosm of how global capitalism and colonialism have shaped our modern world. The nation is São Tomé and Príncipe, and its story is frankly nothing short of a fascinating paradox.
Okay, let's dive right into this. We have to ask ourselves, how exactly did a completely uninhabited volcanic island way out in the middle of the ocean become a global hub for both human trafficking and those highly lucrative cash crops they called green gold? The history of these islands is just a staggering study in extreme contradictions. It's constantly torn between this absolutely untouched, breathtaking natural beauty and a deeply, deeply dark history of human exploitation.
So here's our roadmap for today. We'll start with Part 1, a volcanic hidden gem. Then Part 2 covers sugar, slaves, and cocoa. After that, we'll explore the 20th century in Part 3, independence and instability, followed by the modern promises in Part 4, the El Dorado mirage. And finally, we'll look to the future in Part 5, the paradox of paradise.
Let's start with Section 1, a volcanic hidden gem, the center of the world.
Situated right there in the Gulf of Guinea, basically equidistant between the western coast of Gabon and the southern coast of Nigeria, these two islands were actually formed by a tectonic hotspot right on the boundary of the African and South American plates. And because of that, they developed incredibly unique topographies. São Tomé is highly mountainous. We're talking a peak of 2,024 meters with thousands of these steep vertical streams. Príncipe, which is about 140 kilometers away, is flatter and a lot smaller, just 142 square kilometers. But get this, it is 100% covered in tropical forest and completely draped in a persistent anticyclone. Because they basically just emerged from the sea and stayed isolated from the mainland, they developed this incredibly diverse ecosystem entirely without any native land mammals.
When human settlement finally did happen, it brought profound demographic changes, eventually leading to the creation of a group called the Foros. The Foros are a Creole population, descending from enslaved African workers and Portuguese settlers. Over the centuries, this blending formed the real basis of the modern-day São Toméan. It's a deeply syncretic culture. They've woven together this really rich, vibrant array of music, absolutely incredible dance traditions, and a highly localized, distinct way of life. And you know, that cultural mixing is perfectly reflected in how they speak. Interestingly enough, standard European Portuguese remains the dominant official language, spoken by about 93% of the population. But that remaining 7%, which is really the beating heart of the islanders' actual day-to-day spoken communication, consists of local Portuguese-based Creoles like São Tomé and Lingué, along with a few indigenous dialects. These Creoles are truly the linguistic fingerprint of the archipelago's whole history.
Now, what's really fascinating about this local culture is a highly specific peek into their culinary influences. Take the preparation of a local guinea pig delicacy, for example. It's this highly memorable, very strict 4-day process. First, the animal is procured 4 days in advance and fed a strictly grass diet. Then, and this is wild, dried grass is actually sprinkled into its ear as a diuretic. After that, it gets steeped in a super rich marinade of pepper, oil, garlic, onion, bay leaf, and salt, before finally being stewed in the oven. It's an utterly unique process that really showcases the island's distinct cultural flavors.
Moving on to Section 2, sugar, slaves, and cocoa, the engine of empire.
To really understand how this diverse population arrived in the first place, let's walk through a quick timeline. As we mentioned, the islands were entirely uninhabited until the Portuguese discovered them in the 1470s. Fast forward to the 1540s, and colonists had established massive sugar plantations, fundamentally transforming the islands into one of the very first slave societies of the Portuguese Empire. As sugar eventually declined, the 1800s saw the rise of what they called green gold, which were highly lucrative cocoa and coffee crops. And even though slavery was officially abolished in 1878, the cruel, exploitative economic structures were already firmly set in stone.
To really grasp the sheer scale of this, we have some staggering population estimates from the year 1597. They show roughly 40,000 Portuguese settlers, being completely dwarfed by a massive 170,000 enslaved Africans. This brilliantly and tragically illustrates how the transatlantic slave trade, which was pulling primarily from Angola at the time, massively outpaced the colonial population, just to feed the brutal, insatiable demand of the sugar boom.
And the crazy part is, even after the sugar industry collapsed and slavery was abolished, the islands basically just switched over to cocoa and coffee. Branded as green gold, these 19th century plantations kept all the wealth tightly locked up in the hands of expatriate landowners. This shift maintained those harsh social hierarchies and drastically widened the gap between a very wealthy foreign elite and a deeply impoverished local population. That dynamic laid the exact groundwork for the modern unrest we see later.
Which brings us to Section 3, Independence and Instability, the rocky road to freedom.
Spurred by the 1974 Carnation Revolution over in Portugal, the immediate aftermath of independence for the islands was, well, devastating. A staggering 95% of the island's elite, trained labor force vanished almost instantly when the nation acquired independence in July 1975. The Portuguese settlers fled out of a very real fear of nationalization. They took their capital, they took their expertise with them, and they essentially left the newly born state entirely hollowed out.
The deep despair and total disorientation felt by the citizens during this post-independence turbulence is captured perfectly in a quote from our sources. "A day held a month's life, a month in 5 years and all. Life, what a life." I think this really emotionally anchors just how bewildering and paralyzing this period of rapid transition was for the people actually living through it on the ground.
Let's move forward and see how this instability rippled across the political landscape. Utopian ideals of independence quickly evaporated into decades of structural disarray. The country started with a one-party rule in 1975 under the MLSTP. Then, following the end of the Cold War, they transitioned to a multi-party democracy in 1990. However, elite infighting and severe humanitarian challenges just persisted, eventually erupting into actual military coup attempts in 1998 and again in 2003.
Now for Section 4, the El Dorado Mirage, Oil and the Wealth Gap. Talk about a plot twist. In 1996, huge oil fields were discovered in the Gulf of Guinea. Almost overnight, São Tomé and Príncipe went from relative agricultural obscurity to projecting massive budget surpluses and economic growth rates above 10% per year. It sounded like a dream, right? But the flood of capital brought immediate problems. It quickly became deeply entangled in new waves of political corruption and serious accusations of malfeasance.
The wealth from this so-called El Dorado remains largely trapped today, and it's mostly because of severe bureaucratic roadblocks. The sources highlight a whole laundry list of specific barriers: the sheer lack of a dedicated oil agency, an immature regulatory framework, entirely unpublished contracts, a complete lack of transparency in the bidding process, and way too much state intervention. The entire promise of wealth was simply bogged down in a mire of mismanagement.
So the crucial point here is the stark contrast this mismanagement created on the ground. On one hand, we have the elite, living in colonial-style luxury and openly flaunting their new oil boom wealth. But on the exact same islands, we have the masses, who are still living in extremely poor conditions. We're talking a lack of basic necessities like tap water, reliable electricity, and proper roads. The very inequalities that defined the sugar and cocoa eras, they are absolutely still defining the oil era today.
Which brings us to our final section, the paradox of paradise, the future at a crossroads.
Look, the islands are an endemic biodiversity hotspot. They are truly a natural paradise. But they face severe environmental threats that are pushing them toward absolute ruin right now. They're dealing with increasing urban pressure on delicate coastal ecosystems, widespread deforestation, illegal tree cropping for charcoal production, and severe storm erosion. Their natural capital is literally being undermined daily by the crushing weight of extreme poverty.
But there is a glimmer of hope. There's an alternative path, and that's ecotourism. The islands have these pristine beaches, stunning waterfalls, and totally unique agri-silvopastoral ecosystems that can be heavily leveraged for sustainable, local-level tourism. Now, world-class hotel facilities are practically non-existent right now, but prioritizing investments in sustainable tourism could genuinely alleviate poverty, and it could do so without destroying the very environment that makes these islands so incredibly special.
So, I want to leave you with a provocative question to ponder as we wrap up. Will this hidden volcanic gem succumb to the resource curse just like so many before it? Or will it pioneer a new path of sustainable island tourism? The choice they make will determine the ultimate fate of this incredible microcosm of Africa, and honestly, it serves as a massive warning for emerging economies everywhere. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, Focus Learners. Stay curious, and I'll see you next time.